The studio shimmered under bright lights as anticipation filled the air. Jimmy Kimmel's signature theme music faded just as the audience erupted into applause. From behind the curtain stepped Karoline Leavitt, her stride steady, posture tall, and expression calm yet confident. She wore a tailored outfit that reflected her bold persona, and as she smiled and waved to the crowd, there was a quiet intensity behind her eyes, like she was fully aware this would be no ordinary late-night appearance. The camera panned to her from a low angle, emphasizing her presence. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. The stage was hers just as much as it was Jimmy's, at least for now. The audience greeted her warmly, with a mix of curiosity and respect, but not all applause sounded equal. Some claps were loud, others cautious. She walked toward the host's desk with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment, not for showbiz, but for war. Jimmy stood to greet her, flashing that trademark grin that usually disarms even the most serious of guests. Their handshake was brief, firm, and slightly tense. As they both sat down, Jimmy adjusted his cue cards while Karoline adjusted her microphone. The air between them was cordial on the surface, but a subtle undercurrent suggested that the real show hadn't begun. Jimmy opened with a light remark about the political season, trying to break the ice. Karoline responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, tossing in a diplomatic quip. It was civil, even charming, but the silence between laughs said more than the words. Cameras zoomed in closer, catching every micro-expression. Somewhere off stage, a producer leaned forward, sensing something different. The room held its breath, unknowingly waiting for a spark that would soon become a fire. The conversation eased into motion with Jimmy tossing out a few casual remarks about the chaotic nature of politics, aiming to keep the mood light. Karoline smiled, responding with rehearsed ease, offering a polished opinion about civic engagement and the generational divide in political thinking. It was typical late-night banter, calm, composed, nothing to raise eyebrows. But then Jimmy pivoted. His tone stayed casual, but the question came sharp, a pointed jab at her previous controversial remarks from a recent rally. The audience chuckled nervously, unsure if they were supposed to laugh or brace for something bigger. Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted her seat slightly, looked Jimmy in the eye, and replied with a tone that cut through the playful vibe. Her voice was steady, articulate, and direct. She didn't dodge the question, she doubled down. Jimmy, now sensing the shift, raised an eyebrow and leaned forward. He countered her statement with another jab, this time more sarcastic, adding fuel to a fire that had just begun to catch. The audience reacted louder, not with full laughter but with the kind of noise that says they were now fully invested. Karoline's expression hardened slightly. She fired back with statistics, facts, and a challenge to Jimmy's framing. It wasn't rude, but it wasn't playful either. This wasn't entertainment for her, it was a message. Jimmy tried to pivot again, trying to lighten the mood with a joke about politicians talking in circles. Karoline didn't take the bait. Her reply came swift, calling out media bias with clarity and poise. Suddenly, what was supposed to be a 6-minute interview began to feel like a live debate in prime time. The studio, once buzzing with laughter, had gone still. Viewers at home leaned forward. Something real was happening. The room grew noticeably heavier as the exchange intensified. What began as a light segment had now transformed into a verbal chess match. Karoline sat forward in her seat, eyes locked on Jimmy, delivering her words with precision and force. There was no more smiling, no more polite chuckles. The crowd, sensing the rising tension, fell into a hush. Jimmy crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly, his grin now replaced with a subtle scowl. He questioned her stance on media narratives, implying hypocrisy with a cleverly veiled insult. It was meant to disarm her or at least knock her off balance. It didn't. Karoline, unshaken, leaned in further, her tone sharpened. She countered with a pointed critique of late-night comedy and its role in shaping divisive commentary. It was clear she wasn't just responding, she was striking back. Jimmy, caught off guard by her unflinching delivery, took a moment before responding. He turned to the audience, throwing out a sarcastic one-liner to win back the room, but the laughter was weak, hesitant. The audience was unsure whose side they were on now. Karoline's voice didn't waver. She laid out examples, names, dates, connecting dots with clarity that made it harder to label her remarks as just political spin. The conversation was no longer a back and forth, it had become a collision. Jimmy attempted to steer things back to neutral ground, but Karoline wasn't done. She raised her voice slightly, not shouting, but projecting in a way that demanded attention. Her final point landed like a thunderclap, silencing even the murmurs in the crowd. The tension was no longer simmering, it was boiling. Jimmy looked off stage, his smile returning, but this time, it was forced. The producers behind the cameras exchanged anxious glances. Something had to give. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting briefly toward the control booth behind the cameras. The tension was now thick enough to cut through, and even the studio lights seemed dimmer under the weight of what had just unfolded. Karoline, still composed but visibly emboldened, continued speaking, her voice unwavering as she pressed her argument with a conviction that made it clear she wasn't backing down. The studio crew moved with uneasy precision. One of the floor producers whispered into a headset, nodding urgently to someone off stage. Jimmy's face betrayed a flicker of frustration, his usual cool demeanor beginning to crack. He tried to interrupt with a dismissive remark, hoping to regain control, but Karoline talked right through it. Her tone was now firm, commanding, and carried the unmistakable energy of someone who knew this moment might go viral. The audience didn't know how to respond. Some clapped nervously, others sat frozen, their eyes bouncing between Jimmy and Karoline like spectators at a tennis match. The host made another attempt to pivot, this time with a quick joke, his voice louder, pushing to overpower hers. But Karoline's mic was still live, and she wasn't done. Her words cut through, directly challenging the platform, the narrative, and even Jimmy himself. That was the breaking point. Jimmy looked off camera and gave a subtle wave, barely noticeable, but loaded with meaning. Within seconds, Karoline's mic began to fade. Her voice lowered, not from choice, but from control room decision. She leaned in, realizing her volume had dropped, and glanced toward the cameras with narrowed eyes. Then, like choreography rehearsed in secret, two crew members appeared near the edge of the stage, slowly approaching. Karoline noticed but stayed seated, unfazed. Jimmy forced a smile and turned to the camera as if trying to transition to a commercial break. But Karoline wasn't moving. The tension had reached its peak, and everyone watching, live or at home, felt it. The moment had arrived. Karoline sat still, her posture unwavering as security closed in on her. The audience, once filled with a mix of laughter and clapping, was now eerily silent, caught in the awkwardness of the situation unfolding before them. Jimmy's usual charisma had drained away, replaced by an awkward, strained attempt at maintaining control of the show. The cameras focused on him as he gestured toward the staff, his smile a thin veneer over the tension. It was clear now that this was no longer a friendly interview, this had spiraled into something much more serious. Karoline, however, was a picture of defiance. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made any threatening movements, but her gaze was steely. She wasn't backing down, and the message was unmistakable. She was not going to let them silence her. As the security guards moved closer, one of them subtly gestured for her to stand. Karoline locked eyes with the nearest guard, her expression steady and unblinking. There was no panic, no sudden outburst, just an eerie calm as the entire situation played out live for the millions watching at home. Jimmy, still on camera, shifted awkwardly, his words stumbling as he tried to smooth things over, but his scripted quips no longer carried their usual weight. The audience, once amused, now seemed confused and uncomfortable. Some had already started shifting in their seats, glancing at each other. Others began murmuring, unsure how to react. This wasn't just another late-night skit. This was real, and it was happening on live television. As the security guards reached her side, Karoline finally stood, her eyes never leaving the camera. She wasn't rushing, wasn't being forceful, but her deliberate movements only intensified the awkwardness in the room. The audience shifted in their seats, the uncomfortable murmur growing louder. Karoline took one final glance at Jimmy, her expression unreadable. As she began to move toward the exit, the cameras cut to a commercial break. The screen went dark for a moment, but the social media buzz had already begun. Clips from the live broadcast spread like wildfire, and within seconds, the incident was trending worldwide. In the moments that followed, the internet exploded. Fans, critics, and pundits alike weighed in on the spectacle. Some hailed Karoline as a truth teller, others called her a disruptor. Regardless of where one stood, the impact was undeniable. What was supposed to be just another late-night chat had turned into a viral moment that would be remembered for a long time.